All right, welcome to the Painter's Dialectic Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Green, an artist and art educator living in New York City. And today I'm invited philosopher Dylan Ngan to come talk to us about the ethics of war. In this tumultuous year we're having, I've been thinking about what are the ethics of war and what can I do in my daily life? What are some basic things that I can do? Um, how should a person conduct themselves? How do you preserve human dignity in some of the most inhumane of activities? Is a war even justifiable? So we're going to explore those ideas in a very open way. And Dylan presents for about 20 minutes. And then it's a long, open group discussion that I found to be very beneficial. And remember that all the donations today, please go donate to the IHS collection at the Weinberg Memorial Library at the University of Scranton. You can do that through the link in the description. We're trying to help preserve esoteric wisdom for future generations by fundraising for the library there. So enjoy. All right, welcome everyone. I'm happy you made it. Today we're exploring the ethics of war, probably one of the most challenging topics in ethics and philosophy and spirituality. Today is March 8th, 2006, and 2006 has been one hell of a year so far. It seems like every day we have a major world event that'll shape the future for the next decade. But we're going to be exploring ethics today with philosopher Dylan Ahn. So someone very well equipped to guide us through this. How do we preserve human dignity in the most inhumane of human activities, right? Um, can a war ever be just? You know, is there a context or a vocabulary to critique what is happening, or a vocabulary to understand what is happening? How do we decide our own actions in these times? What is ethical in these own times when it's very ambiguous? And I think what's especially hard about these times is we're dealing with AI. Every war conflict we've seen, there's been a string of AI generated videos amplifying it and distorting what we're seeing. We saw that with Mexico, we saw that in Iran and in Israel. It's hard to tell what's real. Watching our leaders take action, is there a deeper plan? Because it does seem to be a plan. It would make sense to take over the oil in Venezuela before you take on the Middle East, right? One of the primary sources of oil. So it seems there's a deeper plan, but it also looks very impulsive. It's hard to tell what is going on. Just war theory is for times like this. It tries to explore these ideas, and there's also some extremes like political realism. The state is justified to do whatever that keeps the state alive, right? And pacifism, things like the Jains who maybe don't wear clothing and sweep the ground before they take a step and won't eat any root vegetable because they don't want to harm anything and they can't really even live their life. But no matter what we do, we're going to cause harm, right? We're going to cause harm. People are going to get hurt. And there doesn't seem to be any actions today that don't have some type of harm connected to them. Even a vegetarian diet, just farming practices today kill many, many beings. So I'm gonna hand it over to Dylan. Good luck, Dylan.
Thank you.
Good luck with this one.
So I'm going to try and summarize rather quickly a very, very complicated topic, and I'll try and simplify sort of a lot of the technical terms. But feel free to at any point jump in and ask if something is not clear. So as you've set up, Josh, the idea is that we're looking at whether war can be moral. And there are different senses that a war can be moral. Some people believe that moral rules, some people deny that moral rules apply to war. So given that it's a war, everything goes out the window. It's about a matter of survival. Some people believe the complete opposite end of the spectrum, and essentially, given that war involves the taking of life, given the war involves harm, no war can ever be moral, right? There's no plausible moral theory can ever justify this kind of behavior. This would be the pacifist position. So just war theory, or at least traditional just war theory, tries to see if, okay, are there certain kinds of wars that are okay, that can be morally permissible or even justified? So the difference between something being morally permissible and justified is, well, morally permissible just means that it is permissible to do. Justified means that actually we should go to war, that there's certain instances that not only is war okay, but actually something we should seek to do. But more than that, perhaps the nuance is that not only decide which wars are permissible or justified, but exactly where the lines are, morally speaking. So where do we draw the moral constraints? What boundaries? Who are involved? What actions can be performed on who? Which parties? That sort of thing. So, few terminology clarifications. So there is the difference, first of all, between something called just as bellum, which is the moral principle of going to war. So before the war has begun, what reasons do we have to actually go into war? And then there is just in bello, which are the moral principles that guide conduct during war. So the war has begun, right? What is moral? What is immoral? So the first kind, going into war, we might think that okay, the only kind of war that is just is that it has some kind of just cause. So maybe the war is an attempt to avert some greater harm, right? We're trying to avoid some greater amount of suffering. That's why we're going to war. That's okay. Or we might think that a war is okay as long as it's fought by an entity that has the authority to fight such wars. So an individual has no right to declare war, but maybe a government, a state, a monarch, that is the only kind of legitimate authority that can declare a war. We might think that it relies on some kind of right intention. So we have to have some kind of just cause that we intend to achieve. And it can't be just an excuse to achieve some kind of wrongful end. So we can't sort of have a false purpose that we're going to war for. It has to have some kind of reasonable prospect of success. So there's no point in a pointless war. So even if a war is just, but it's so unlikely to achieve its aim, so unlikely to be successful, we might think that that is what makes a war unjustified. There's the point about proportionality. Are the things that we're trying to achieve sort of a good enough thing that it outweighs the cost of war? So, given that war must involve harm, are the goods good enough to justify that kind of cause? The last sort of point is whether it is necessary. So, a lot of people will think that actually wars are only justified if it is carried out as a kind of last resort. We've tried all the diplomatic ways to go about it. We've tried all the economic ways to go about it. War is the only way left. That's the only reason why a war can be just. So, as for during a war, there are fewer sort of conditions. The first is discrimination. So, while a war is taking place, some believe that we have to distinguish between who we can attack and who we can't. So, who are the targets of war? So, people might think, okay, there are military objectives, military personnel, combatants, and we have to distinguish this from civilians and non-military objectives. So you can bomb, for instance, an armory or a factory that's producing weapons, but you can't bomb a hospital, for instance. The second point is proportionality. So you have to be able to take into account foreseen but unintended harms. So, of course, there are going to be casualties that are civilian in nature. But first of all, they have to be unintended. But second of all, are these kind of unintended harms proportionate to the military advantage achieved? So are the goals good enough that we could risk civilian casualty, for instance? The third is necessity. So are the ways that a war is being conducted the least harmful means feasible? So, for instance, we outlaw chemical weapons, for instance. Um, so based on that, we have the notion of what we call just and unjust combatants. So the basic idea that just combatants and unjust combatants basically determine whether someone is liable to be killed. Right? So if a person is a combatant, if a person is liable to be killed in war, that means they've lost the moral right to self-defense. They're up for grabs. They're not innocent. So traditional just war theory has three basic tenets. The first is that they think that the principles that guide conduct during a war are independent of the principles that guide going to war. These are two separate things. So even you may be on the wrong side, you might be fighting for the wrong cause, you nevertheless are entitled to the moral principles that guide conduct during a war. So even if the other person is on the wrong side, you're not allowed to do certain things to them. So this is the independence of conduct during a war and going into war. The second tenet is the moral equality of combatants. So regardless, again, of which side you are on, you might be on the wrong or right side. Nevertheless, you're morally equal. You fight permissibly, regardless of what you are fighting for. Right? You are still respected as a combatant, even if you're so-called right fighting on the wrong side. And then the third is discrimination, right? So combatants are legitimate targets of attack, while non-combatants are not. So what is the motivation behind these tenets? The basic idea is it's an extension of the right to self-defense. So if someone is trying to hurt me, someone's trying to kill me, then I'll have a right to defend myself. So again, the moral permissibility of killing in war does not depend on whether the combatant side is just. It does not matter which side you're on, because what you're acting from is self-defense. And the reason why we discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, well, because combatants, we think, pose a threat on each other's lives, and non-combatants do not. So the right to self-defense obviously only applies to those who threaten your life. Non-combatants don't, so they are not legitimate targets of attack. So McMahon thinks that actually all three tenets are wrong. He doesn't agree with any of the three principles of just war theory. He thinks that actually any argument against number two, so the idea that both sides are morally equal, is wrong, and therefore actually the independence between moral principles that guide going to war and conduct during war, and also the idea of distinguishing combatants and non-combatants are all wrong. So why is that the case? So his first disagreement is with this idea of self-defense, and he thinks, well, even if the right to self-defense is correct, the first attack is still impermissible if you're on the wrong side. Because if you're on the wrong side, then the other side is not a threat. You're the problem. So how could you be morally equal to the other side? So he thinks that actually whose side you're on does matter. It determines whether you are on the moral side or the immoral side. And that should determine whether you should be treated with morals in mind. The other argument is that he thinks, well, the naive view of the right to self-defense is just plainly wrong. So he uses the example of a murderer and the police officer. So if a murderer is about to kill some innocent people and a police officer takes aim to kill the murderer, well, you can't say, or the murderer can't say, well, I'm allowed to kill the police officer because this is an act of self-defense. Self-defense does not apply here. It's not permissible in this case. So he thinks that if you're on the wrong side, you're essentially on the side of the murderer. You're not allowed to say, well, I'm just acting out of self-defense. McMahon says, no, you're on the wrong side. It doesn't count. So Walzer has an objection, and he thinks, well, there is a significant difference between combatants and murderers and criminals. So he thinks that, well, the analogy is faulty because when it comes to combatants, they don't often have a choice, right? It might be conscription. They're made to be soldiers. Or they might be manipulated into thinking that their cause is just. Or there might be some epistemic constraints. Ordinary soldiers may not know if they're fighting for a just cause or not. So that makes them different from criminals. That means that self-defense still applies. McMahon says that actually the idea that all combatants are under duress might be an overstatement. It may be the case that there are willing soldiers. Like they do think that they're, doing it, they're joining the army out of their own choice. The second reply is that even if they were under duress, he doesn't think that that's good enough to justify wrongful killings. So saying that you don't have a choice, saying that you're conscripted into the army for the wrong side is not good enough to justify wrongful killings. A lot of people have that view. They think that if you're on the wrong side, you should just lay down your arms. It's not good enough just to say that you're following orders. More importantly, he thinks that these are not moral reasons, but excuses. So yes, the difference in a legal context is that you don't waive moral responsibility when you're making an excuse. You're just saying that you deserve a lighter punishment. So in a legal context, you can plead guilty or not guilty, but you could plead guilty with an excuse. So you're saying, yes, I do take moral responsibility, but given these excuses, I would like a lighter sentence. McMahon thinks that this belongs to that category. You're still morally responsible, you're still morally wrong, but given these contextual reasons, we might punish you less if you're tried for a war crime, for instance. So he goes on to say that, well, not only do we have those concerns about self-defense, he also thinks unjust combatants can't satisfy the traditional proportionality constraint. So what he means by this is, well, if you're fighting on the wrong side, there is no such thing as a good of war. There are no goods to achieve in war if you're on the wrong side. All you're doing are achieving bad effects. So nothing you do could possibly be considered proportional. Nothing you do could possibly be considered just. So if you happen to be on the wrong side, you do not fulfill the necessary condition for permissible conduct in war. Nothing you do can possibly be justified. So certain conclusions. He says, well, there is an exception. He says, well, you might think that, okay, unjust combatants, those who fight on the wrong side, may act permissibly if they are actively preventing unjust acts of war by just combatants. So maybe the people on the right side are doing bad things, and you're trying to prevent them from doing bad things. He thinks that's okay, in which case you are acting permissibly. But even then, those kind of actions are such a small proportion of what is going on, it basically doesn't come into the equation here, right? It's very, very rare that this sort of thing happens. And even then, we have to take it by a case-by-case basis. And it's very rare that that would warrant the use of force by an unjust combatant. So he acknowledges that there is this exception, but it is such a limited range of cases that it doesn't really come into the larger picture. Then he argues against number 3, which is a little bit more controversial. He thinks, well, given his disagreement with number 2, he thinks that, well, then he also disagrees that there is a legitimate distinction between combatants and non-combatants. Namely, that combatants are legitimate targets of attack, while non-combatants are not. He thinks that there are certain instances where non-combatants are also legitimate targets of attack if they're on the bad side, if they're on the wrong side. So, for example, people might argue that the reason why non-combatants shouldn't be legitimate targets of attack is because, unlike unjust combatants, they don't pose a threat on your life, at least not in a direct shooting you kind of way. Therefore, you could only permissibly target unjust combatants and not non-combatants. But McMahon thinks that that is just false. He thinks that that is not the only way for a person to pose a threat. Holding a gun and shooting it is not the only way to pose a threat. It is very, very possible for non-combatants to also pose a threat by supporting economically or politically. You need not be violent in order to pose a threat. Just by being a non-combatant shouldn't excuse you from being a legitimate target of attack. So he goes even further, that he thinks that some people, even civilians, bear significant responsibility for either initiating or sustaining an unjust war. They might be supporting a political party or a system of government that is doing the unjust war. And so he thinks that, well, in that case, there might be grounds to think that they become a legitimate target in war, given that they are morally responsible for the unjust threat, the unjust war in the first place. So just because a person is a quote unquote civilian doesn't mean they cannot be legitimate targets of war. But of course, that responsibility comes in a degree, right? It depends on who the non-combatant is and what their moral responsibilities are. So what did they actually do? So if they are a key supporter in building weapons or facilitating an unjust regime, then they might be arguably fully responsible and they are a totally legitimate target of attack. But obviously, if you were just a simple civilian who had no part, then you wouldn't be responsible at all. But it's arguable as to whether those civilians exist, right? Some people might argue that non-action is a kind of action. So not voting against a particular regime might count as a degree of responsibility. So basic summary, McMahon thinks that just war theory is just wrong. This idea that there is an independence between the causes going into war and the conduct in which a war should be carried out are not independent. The cause and the side you're on matters, and therefore combatants are not equally liable to be killed. If you're on the wrong side, right, that matters. You are not on morally equal footing with the combatants on the right side. And non-combatants on the wrong side are also sometimes permissible targets of attack. So that's all. I'd like to hear what you might think about that.
Okay, before we move on, that was a lot. Do you think you could sum that up briefly? And then I'd like you to just mention political realism and pacifism, and then maybe introduce structural and cultural violence too.
Yeah. So essentially, just war theory thinks that there are good reasons to go to war. And did you mention sort of pacifism? So pacifism would be to take the opposite reason, that there are no good reasons to go to war. And some people might object to just war theory by saying, yes, there might be some guiding good reasons to go to war, but they are determinant of how we behave ourselves in war. So if you are on the right or wrong side, that will determine your moral footing within a war. So if you happen to be on the wrong side, the only morally just course of action for you to do is to lay down your arms and surrender. There is no morally right way for the wrong side to carry on a war, is the basic idea of McMahon. Political realism basically just does away with this idea that there is a case for morality. So it's a form of the first kind where they say, well, in war, the moral laws or the moral principles don't apply. It's just a matter of survival, right? So people are allowed to do whatever it takes to survive, to sustain a political system. This idea that there are sort of right or wrong things to do in war is just plain silly. These are sort of luxuries that we have at times of peace, but they do not apply in times of conflict.
Also, just war theory is very old,
Mm.
right? I think it was developed around the Middle Ages with Aquinas and everything.
Mm.
But today we have drones, we got chemical weapons, we have information warfare, propaganda, mind control tactics. Like, it's hard to apply this to a modern age where you can just launch an entire war at a click of a button. And I don't even know, you talked about the role of non-combatants too. I think a lot of people are just unaware and can't even keep up with what's going on and don't even know what's going on. So I don't know how, but there's also new types of philosophies of war that aren't directly violent, like structural violence, right?
Mhm.
You think you could mention what that is, or cultural violence?
Yeah, you're certainly right that the nature of what we mean by war has changed over time. So, war doesn't necessarily have to mean going to battle where you can engage in physical combat with another, right? You can have a trade war, an economic war, a political kind of war. And just war theory essentially only covers the kind that threatens, someone physically or harms life. And so there's limited applicability to other aspects. There are different ways to conquer or to defeat sort of another state or a legitimate authority without using those kind of methods. Um, so you're right. There is such things as structural or cultural violence, where you essentially attack one of the tenets or one of the aspects of what makes a uh, just war, just cause of war possible. So, for example, you might decide that the best way to go about it is to try and build a narrative where there is no just cause, or you try and build a just cause out of nothing, right? So, for example, this is a common tactic used in the Second World War, where a soldier goes missing, and that could be the starting point of a war. And so one side will claim, well, you clearly kidnapped one of our soldiers, and that will lead to a full-scale invasion. So you can manufacture sort of a just cause. Or you might say that you're trying to create a better world, right? For a brighter future, right? That could be a manufactured just cause. Or you could delegitimize a legitimate authority. So this is a common tactic as well. So you say, actually, you're not an independent state, right? What we're doing is not, you know, engaging in war. What we're merely doing is reclaiming, right, some land that we already owned. You were never an independent, legitimate authority in the first place. There has only been one legitimate authority. So technically speaking, this is not a war. This is merely sort of national defense or national security or whatever. Or you might decide to, go about speaking of reasonable prospect of success, where you might try and convince the other side, well, you may be just, but the cost and the likelihood of you winning is so minimal, you might as well give up now. So you could sort of go about it that way. Or you might decide to convince the other side through proportionality. So you might try and say, well, is it worth it, right, to try and defend your home or your nation? Like, is it worth being put through all of this sort of suffering? Isn't it easier, or is it more proportional to just give up and surrender? Um, or you might think that, you might try and convince the other side that there is a better course of action, which is maybe to give up land or resources, or to concede economically, or to concede parts of the place you own for the sake of peace. So there are ways to go about using just war theory as a basis for trying to convince the other side that they don't have a cause for war by essentially attacking one of the reasons why they might not have a just cause, even if they might be on the quote unquote right side. So you can go about it that way. You could go about it, as you rightly say, structurally. You can pinpoint, that there's something illegitimate about the government that they have, or their status as an independent nation. You could do it culturally. You could say, well, culturally, you might not look at it politically, but culturally, you've always been part of us. So therefore, you are. So you can go about it that way. So yeah, there are different ways of going about it, and there's a lot of nuances as well. So people often make the statement about China and how it's never invaded another country, technically. But they've just turned their way of invasion into a different kind of format, right? They've sort of expanded their territory by using or manipulating one of those causes. Right? A common tactic is to say that, well, the other side is immoral, and what I'm actually doing is introducing a better way of life for you barbarians, right? And so if China's never invaded, or the what we call sort of the state, as China has never invaded another. How did it get so big in the first place? Well, conflict must have happened in history. It's just that we've kind of just accepted the narrative that it's always been a civil war. But of course, back then, they never thought of themselves as part of the same country. And so, how we perceive what counts as a nation or a culture um, can make these aspects more complicated, can determine what counts as a war or merely a internal issue, or merely a rebellion. So how you label something or how you manipulate perception can get you around all of these intricacies of what counts as a just war. Does that help answer at least a little bit of the things that you were mentioning?
Yeah, and I think as far as us and our daily lives, I think we can think of war starting right here. Way, way back in time, you and me did episode 5 of this podcast talking about how the CIA influenced art in this kind of Cold War state, right? They promoted modern artists as a symbol of American freedom. But at the end of that, we talked about the perfect type of propaganda would be one that's on you all the time, that you watch it all the time, and that you're physically addicted to it, right? So on Instagram, I see propaganda every day. I see a lot of Chinese propaganda. Every Chinese video, it's this craftsman, and it's really beautiful shot, and they're working really hard, and then I see videos about Russia. Usually it's like people that are really drunk or doing something ridiculous. We're watching these same videos. We don't realize it's propaganda, but we watch it year after year, and it's subconsciously forming how we see, and also waking up and seeing bombings every day. I'm becoming less and less empathetic. Maybe 5 or 10 years ago, watching that video would have been devastating. But today, it's part of my daily routine. I watch someone die, watch a civilization collapse, and then I go to work. And I talked to my grandma who's 93, and she thinks the world stayed the same. The only thing that's different is this information technology. We can now see and feel and know everything that's happening. And that's why it feels so much more chaotic now than in the past. But I don't know. I think let's open it up to the group now. If anyone wants to ask Dylan a question or put forward, a tricky idea or maybe some things that you're thinking about and how ethics applies to your life, now's the time.
Hey, Dylan, this is Reem. Wanted to ask you because, in terms of what's going on, and I agree with Josh 100%, it's very easy to get sucked in and to be manipulated into feeling a certain way without realizing it because of the bombardment of information, whether we want it or not. in some ways. And then also there's a dopamine factor that makes us addicted to these devices. And we go to, oh, let's see if it's going to rain later. Should I bring an umbrella? You go to your phone and you're not checking the weather app. You've gone to social media because you're already trained to do that. And that's where you are. So I guess my question for you is, what do you do in order to stay in a place of peace on a day-to-day basis under circumstances such as this, where we're going to war with countries that it seems to kind of come out of nowhere, and there it does appear to me that there's a much larger agenda, and we're not aware of all of it. How do you continue to be in a place of self-preservation, of peace?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there is no sort of one answer, but I will sort of talk a little bit about, dependent on my sort of psychological well-being, how I choose to handle it. So, for instance, I think first of all, it's about deciding when you'd like to have that information. So it's about being selective about, okay, when am I going to sort of be informed about this sort of news or what's going on in the world? And then you could be selective about whether you are psychologically prepared to do that. So when you are not psychologically prepared to have that information, the easiest tactic, and this applies to other situations as well, is distraction, do something else. So for people who meditate, that is always a good kind of distraction. So if you're doing something, if you're allocating time into doing something else, well, it forcibly takes you away from being exposed to that information and to that kind of news. But you might think that, well, isn't that just sort of putting your head in the ground and ignoring the information? Well, it would be if you did that all the time. So you can't allow yourself to be completely uninformed and not pay attention to what's going on in the world either. But in moments where you're not psychologically prepared to sort of deal with that, then distraction might be the way to go. If I do feel like, okay, now I want to spend some time being informed and trying to understand what's happening in the world, then I will dedicate some time where I am having a look at this sort of thing. And then it's a matter of choosing not just time, but also source. So maybe Instagram is not the most favorable or the best source of what's going on in the world at the moment. Um, and we used to think that maybe the news is better or newspapers are better, but nowadays it's questionable. So you might want to sort of use this as an exercise of what are the facts. So the news may not just be telling us what the information is anymore, but by selectively giving us different parts of information, or only one side of the information, or disguising information as disguising opinion as information, may try and sort of tell us a narrative rather than the situation. So it's always a good idea to have a variety of sources, especially if you're aware that the sources belong to one side or another of the political spectrum. So if you feel like that, okay, I want to be informed, then you also have to be critically informed. So deciding right time to be informed, but also the right way to be informed. And then afterwards, it's about taking a break from it. So by allocating a specific time to engage with this information, that also means knowing when to stop. So critically examining the information, yes, engage with it, see how that affects your life. And that may mean something to you politically or emotionally. That may result in some sort of action that you might decide to engage in. Talk about it on a podcast, for example. But afterwards, you have to know when to set it aside and to get back to something else and to whatever it is. So knowing when to pick up something and knowing when to set it down again is a good idea. So in essence, the advice is to approach it mindfully and with structure. So if you are going to engage with it, if that is what you'd like to do, you do it with intention. You do it being fully uh, mindful of how you choose to engage with it, if you are going to engage with it. I suspect that if the emotional response you're feeling is actually desensitivity, or on the other end, you're being overwhelmed, it's a good sign that there has been too much and you need to take a little bit of break from the information. Because then you are no longer actively really engaging or being mindful of the information anymore. It's no longer doing something for you. It's no longer making you a more empathetic or more lovingly kind or compassionate person. It's just information for information's sake. So we have to be mindful of the fact that information is meant to be a tool. It's meant to be useful. It's meant to serve some kind of purpose for us. And hopefully that purpose is to do something good. If that information fails to serve that purpose, then maybe we need to reevaluate our relationship with that information and how we engage with it. It's more difficult than it sounds. You have to, it relies on a bit of self-discipline. There are a lot of apps nowadays that do the discipline part for you, where maybe in certain times of the day they lock your access to certain apps. So if you are the kind of person that you can't help but go to social media every time you check the weather, then maybe it's a good sign to start, using some of those devices to help yourself. I hope that somewhat answers your question. Does anybody else have suggestions on how to approach them?
I want to share an app I found. It's called Ground News, and it uses an AI to go through um, all the major news networks, and then it compiles the stories. And so, for example, you can see these blue, white, and red lines. The blue shows the more liberal news outlets, the red shows the conservative news outlets, and then the white is just kind of centrist. So, say if you're really into the liberal or conservative, you could see your blind spots. It literally says blind spots. And then if you click on one, it can show you how many times this story was broadcasted and where are the sources. So if you wanted to read more, you could. And I've really enjoyed this because if you look at Instagram, there's music playing, there's usually a guy talking, and it's very emotional. It's bypassing your reasoning and critical thinking, and it's trying to make you feel a certain way and to act in a certain way all day, right? And I think people can become addicted to worry. And I think we're finding out in today's society that rage sells better than sex or whatever. Rage is the top seller. That's our time. Is defined by rage baiting, but it's trying to get you to act or to think or to do something in a certain way all day. And you're also in the echo chamber, right? If you get all your information through social media, it's biased. So I think apps like that, for me, have helped a lot.
Yeah, you're right that we live in an attention economy.
Yeah.
So anything we could do to try and wrestle a bit of that attention back is a good idea.
I will say, and I kind of wanted to bring it up with the group if anyone else is like following this story and feels some type of way or has opinions about it, but like the Ellisons having just paid $11 billion to buy CBS and CNN, like that's kind of been hitting me in a weird way, like where things are feeling very real, like because those were very sort of centrist or maybe more on the liberal side media platforms and huge, like nationally historic, and there's so much history there. And like I know a few weeks ago, like New York Times was saying in their podcast that one of the 60 Minutes sessions got pulled last minute about the detention camps in Guatemala, and they replaced it with something like fluffier. And so you're seeing the takeover of kind of free speech happening in real time. And like social media has been doing that. And obviously there are biases with every media platform, but it feels like we are getting our access to things that are more like different sides where we can think critically and kind of make our own opinions. It seems like it's just shrinking so quickly. And so I'm having trouble like sort of letting that go and being a little bit more or less emotional about it, I guess.
Thank you for bringing that up, Rosalie. Yes, not only did Larry Ellison buy CNN and CBS, but also acquire TikTok. So absolutely, what we're being fed is very much a menu that's in somebody else's hands. You know, we no longer have control over what our food options are, it seems. So I love the app that you mentioned, Josh, because that helps us find other sources. Because it's, for me, and I don't know if this is the case for you, Rosalie, but for me, as soon as I heard about that, I stopped watching CBS, CNN. I don't go there for news anymore because I know basically that's a media corporation that's owned, and they get to decide what we learn and not learn. And then on top of that, there are countries that have banned happening right now. So, you don't get to see what's happening in Israel. You get to be told what's happening in Israel. You don't get to know everything about all of these other countries, and what are the false flags that are happening. You begin to question all of the information that you once took for granted as being truth, and then you realize that there are spins on everything. And I don't know if anyone had come across this, but I did, and it was this fascinating clip on social media about how the schools that were just bombed in Iran, how the articles were written in different magazines, the headlines. And one said, Iran reports civilian private school struck, or yeah, and struck. Whereas another one said 168 innocent lives taken forever. So, you don't think that they're even the same incident because of the way that they're being, promoted in terms of, these are the articles. So yeah, there's a huge difference in how something is plated, so to speak, and presented to you. And for me, one of the things that I've tried to do is I pay very good attention Sunday mornings to the little notification that comes up on my cell phone of how much time I've spent daily on my phone. And it's been creeping up. I tried to keep it under, 7 hours a day, which is just an extraordinary amount of time. I am now today 9 hours, 39 minutes, because what's changed? Now I'm paying attention to, I just can't get enough of what's happening here, what's happening there, what's going on there, things like that. And then I have to kind of say to myself, okay, how much is really within my control? And I love your suggestion, Dylan, of setting aside time when you know this is what you're going to do and take control over what you're consuming as opposed to allowing it to consume you. So one of the things that I had started doing a couple of weeks ago is I put my cell phone not even on the same floor, because it used to be same floor, different room. Now it's on a different floor that it charges. So it's not the first thing I reach for, because if it's in the same floor, I will reach for that. And even with the best of intentions, I'll just meditate after I just check what the weather is. And then, of course, I'm on social media because I'm not really checking the weather. Uh, so it's like all of these little tricks that I have to kind of, current me has to trick future me into not picking up, the phone before meditating. And once I meditate, I feel so much more, grounded. And I have this really cool, meditation practice where I ask 3 questions. One is, what would I like to do today? The next is, if there was only one thing I could do today, what would it be? And then the third one is, how can God bless me today? And, that's part of what I do in my meditation. And it resets what's called the reactivating I always pronounce this wrong. The reactivating, it's the RAC. And basically what the RAC is it's our own ability to kind of look for information that proves our beliefs to be true. And if you set the course on, this is going to be a challenging day, I've got so much to do and I can't get to all of it, I'm not sure how I'm going to do it. If you walk into your day with this feeling of being overwhelmed and defeated, you will be overwhelmed and defeated. So when those 3 questions are asking about, they're putting it in a way, phrasing it in a way of, I get to do, not I have to do. And then it's not as overwhelming. And then it feels like a privilege. And then what's the one thing I'd like to do? Oh, what I love to do is, and then you start looking forward to something as opposed to dreading it, which was, my own, MO, which was always like, that was my natural habitat was, what do I dread every morning when I wake up? I would start thinking of my to-do list. And now it puts it in a different perspective entirely. And then the last one is my favorite, which is, how can God bless me today? And, it started with these great big asks. Oh, if my social media blows up, if I have, and then I start thinking about it and I'm like, wait, what is it that I'm really looking for? I'm looking to make a difference. So then it became like, how could God bless me? Became, if somebody smiles at me unprovoked, what a blessing that is, or if someone comes to me and says, I need help, and I offer help and I feel better having offered that help, being of service, that's a blessing. So as I move on, and today's was, what would be the blessing? It would be just to be alive. That would be my blessing. Just to be safe today would be my blessing. And you begin to realize that your blessings don't have to be a viral video. Your blessings can be like seeing the sunlight after not having seen it here in New York for many, many moons. So yeah, I guess those are all ways that I try to cope. I don't know if that's been helpful to other people or if they have other suggestions that I'd love to try. Please chime in.
Yeah, I think I wanted to chime in here. Yeah, hey Dylan, this is Capo. I've been following you a little bit on Instagram. I think because I'm a little older, I think it's because of you guys that I got on Instagram somehow. Before that, I was barely on it. Anyway, for me, because obviously I'm a little on the older side, I stuck with the kind of traditional news, but I try to vary it a little bit and I try to challenge myself. I don't only stick to what I agree with or what I like, because I think both sides actually use the propaganda. So I'll watch Al Jazeera, which is a little more on the ground in the Middle East, and CNN, as she said. And DW is the German kind of news. I found it a little more neutral. It kind of give you, most of the time, give you the fact. They have a few of these same opinion shows, but most of them are very kind of matter of fact, direct. They tell you what it is. So that's what I try to do. And I also use the same thing Rim does to stay away from social media. I don't sleep in the same room with my phone. I don't have a TV in my bedroom. I get up, I meditate, I think about it, I read sometime, and by the time I touch my phone, I'm kind of already grounded. So the other things I've learned it not really long ago from a guy I work with at work. He's kind of his life coach and supposed to teach us how to manage other people. I think he called it the three doors: stillness. I think it's called stillness of the body, silence of the speech, and spaciousness of the mind, where you center yourself in this stillness, looking for refuge. You do it in the morning is good, but I've noticed that over the day, as you do it more and more, it gets easier to get back to that stillness. So even in the middle of watching the news or something that kind of affects you, you can always get back, and it gives you a little more clarity. I think I can probably give some more details about it later because I'm also learning it myself. But so these kind of things. So the thing is, as you spread these things over the day, it helps. But if you only do it at one time, so that's why I like Reem thing, where if you put that anchor saying, what is my blessing? If somebody smiles at me, then through the course of the day, you can relate to it instead of just meditating and it's gonna kind of, carrying a little bit. So I like that approach from Reem. But the main question I had though for Dylan is what we've defined just cause and a moral war and ethics. What is considered moral and what is considered ethics, so that at least we have a basis to justify everything else. That was my main question.
Yeah, so that becomes even more difficult once you get into the nuance of exactly what causes are just. So that depends on, as you rightly say, between what you consider to be moral actions and immoral actions. So for the pacifists, for instance, their line is quite solid, right? So if you're harming an individual, if you're killing someone, that's immoral, right? So therefore, there is no such thing as a just war because a just war must involve harming or the killing of another. Some people believe that that line is a little bit more sort of, or less solid, or it depends, or more contextual. So consequentialists, for instance, believe that, well, maybe the metric is just a matter of utility. What we're looking for is the largest amount of pleasure for the largest amount of people. And that gives you a lot more leeway in terms of killing. So if you can do a little bit of violence, but it gives you a lot of pleasure, right? A lot of oil, right? So that makes it just. That makes it okay. So the difference between morality and ethics is morality gives you some sort of standard, a sort of value system. Ethics is more about the specific things, the specific actions that are good or not good to do, and to what degree. So some people are categorical, right? Like the pacifists, like there are certain actions that are just wrong to do. Some people are more consequential, depends on the consequences of the actions, and that immorality comes as a degree rather than a sort of yes or no. But I think, political realists will say, well, it's just a matter of what you can get out of it. It's a matter of what benefit or what gain could be levied out of any particular action. So their perception of morality is less about right or wrong. They don't think of things in terms of right or wrong, but more in gain and loss. Does this result in some sort of advantage or gain for me or a state, or some sort of loss? So it's tricky, right? Some people who are more pessimistic don't think that just war theory is viable, not because of objections to one of its principles, but because it so inadequately covers the real interests that nations have in going to war. That when nations decide to go to war, what they're really thinking about is not whether it's just or moral or ethical. What they're really thinking is how much I can get out of this. So it's the wrong tool for the job. We've imposed a sort of kind of idyllic picture where we're asking nations to be some kind of good person that cares about whether they have good reasons for war, but maybe in actuality they don't, right? That certain systems in play, certain nations, that they're not thinking in those terms at all, and so just war theory is not even outdated, but maybe just completely unreflective of how how we engage politically with the world nowadays. Does that help clear sort of
Yeah,
things up a little? Yeah.
it
So
is. It is. Yeah.
Yeah, whether like even though Mahan uses like individual case by case examples to talk about just war, it's also unclear whether there is it makes sense to scale up in that way. So does the criminal and police officer example as an individual case even scale up to something as big as nations go into war? Some people think they're not, you can't make these things equivalent. That when we're talking about scales to that degree, it no longer makes sense to talk about individual case by case morality. So those are the people who think that actually the same moral rules don't apply. Then when we talk about morality and ethics in a personal way, an individual day-to-day way, they don't mean the same thing, or they shouldn't mean the same things when we talk about war. Um, Josh, you mentioned something about drone warfare. Like there are a lot of interviews of soldiers who are responsible for using the drones, and they always have a very, very interesting sort of dilemma psychologically. They don't really know what to make of it themselves because
Exactly.
every part of their personal experience doesn't suggest to them that this is a moral thing that's happening. You're using a controller, you're looking at information on a screen. It doesn't register as a moral act. Whereas if you like, good old fashioned shooting someone does register experientially as a moral act. You are killing someone. And so the experience of, for instance, a World War II soldier and their moral dilemma is drastically different to the
Different.
psychological dilemma of someone operating a drone. And so it's much easier for a person operating the drone to dismiss the morality side of it because none of it, they switch off the computer, they go back home, right? Whereas if you're a soldier in the trenches, it's a completely different environment, it's a completely
Exactly.
different experience of morality. So maybe it's in the interests of government to use technology to kind of disassociate the realities of war with the common combatant, right? The more they are separated from what it means to take a life, the better. Then there is, you know, you avoid all of the unsavory consequences psychologically, and perhaps, problems back home.
The White House, I think on February 28th or after that, once we started bombing Iran, put out a reel with real videos of the bombings, but it was in a first-person video game perspective, right? And I think that goes into what you're talking about, gamifying war. And I think also, I think the majority of us are in a pretty spoiled and privileged spot.
Real
We
time.
have the time to do this. Most people, in a lot of parts of the world, are just happy to be alive. Or if they have any resources or spare food. Over the course of this podcast, I've interviewed a lot of people in active warfare. So if you go back, you can listen to the one under the Biden administration when we pulled out of Afghanistan. Abu talks about seeing people throw their babies over a wire fence at the airport, hoping that the soldiers would catch them and take them out. And him being in high school with the Taliban coming in. I think that was an incredibly, immoral act that we did. But hearing that, he got out of Afghanistan, he's in Russia now, getting an education to become a doctor and hoping that he can go back and help. But he's, I think, an incredibly virtuous person and he's very optimistic and positive, which is incredible. And when I was interviewing, Anastasia about the Ukraine invasion and hearing about a pregnant mother that lives on the 12th floor where there's no electricity in the building, she has to walk down the 12 floors to go find an ATM to take out cash, and then she has to go find a grocery store, and maybe none of the ATMs have cash, and then she's got to go find a doctor and stuff. Um, America's separated by two oceans, and we're heavily defended, and we don't have to deal with that. But hearing about what's going on in Mexico, friends in Mexico's family hiding in place, or people in Israel or whatever hiding in bunkers every day. Um, it's a lot trickier. We're in this very privileged position, and we're kind of out of touch with that, I guess. Um, I don't know. I've made it a point to actually reach out to people in these crises. When the stuff in Minneapolis going on, I reached out to people in Minneapolis who are artists on my Instagram. What is actually going on? Or with Afghanistan,
Yeah.
I've reached out to people, what is actually going on? Or in the Middle East or whatever. I've always made a point to do that because there's these, once communication breaks down, then you're just stuck in your own ideology. And I think I'm really proud of this group because we're a very diverse group. We have Jewish, Christian, Muslims all in a group, East and West, black and white, whatever. We're all coming together and talking. And I think that's an extraordinary act of courage and peace in times like this. And I think we can all be courageous. And I heard a lot of people focus about what they still can get from life. But what do we bring to life? You know, when everything goes to shit, what do we have? What are the resources that we bring to the table? What are we bringing and giving to life? And I think our culture is always focused on extracting as much as possible from life. But I think in Buddhism and many other esoteric systems, you come to a place where it's about giving. What can you give each day? What can you do each day in a simple way that helps, that assists? And you kind of let go of ideologies and the ambiguity of philosophy and stuff, and you just focus on your being and giving and doing simple, sustainable things over time. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're definitely right that one of the ways that we reevaluate a relationship with the information is what that information is actually doing for us. So obviously, we might be getting information about conflicts all over the world, but we are powerless to do anything about that. But one way that information can be helpful is, rather than desensitizing us from empathy, is to realize that there is suffering in the world and we can do something about the suffering nearby. So yes, like obviously we're powerless to do something about the conflicts far away, but we can turn the negative emotions of anxiety and worry about things happening very, very far away into motivation for acts of kindness very, very close to home. And so for some people, that might not be enough, right? That there's a false equivalency. At the end of the day, terrible things are still happening very, very far away. However, given that you're using that, as you rightly say, to do a little bit of giving, it was better than before. At least now it's the worry and the anxiety and negativity plus acts of kindness rather than just the anxiety and the worry and the negative emotions. So comparatively, that's a little bit better than before. But other than that, I think you're also right, thinking that kindness and acts of kindness may not need to be as straightforward as that. I think people underestimate their influence politically, right? So just by having conversation, just by reaching out to others, just by sharing thoughts and ideas, may not seem like it's helping in any sort of direct way. But politically, I think it may have an influence. But that's also perhaps being a little bit optimistic. Maybe that influence is not enough, right? It's a common problem in political philosophy called the problem of aggregation. Like individually, our actions don't actually have an effect. Nevertheless, any effect that does occur is a product of a collective group of actions. So this is a problem and seemingly is a paradox because on one hand, one picture looks like our individual actions have no impact. On the other, it says that our impact is dependent on our individual action. Those two facts are simultaneously true at the same time, even though conceptually they seem to be paradoxical. But people who are more optimistic say that it is more hopeful or helpful to believe or to have the mindset of the latter. It is better to think that everybody else is cooperating and you are the only missing bit of impact than it is to think that you're the only one helping and nobody else is cooperating. So given that both facts are true, you can choose to believe or focus on the particular fact that motivates the most action or is more hopeful or is more likely to deliver a positive sort of outcome. Otherwise, it's very easy to sink into sort of helplessness, which is a lot of people who practice Mahayana Buddhism, for instance, who try to cultivate the Bodhisattva path, often come across helplessness. On one hand, you're being encouraged to engage and to be empathetic and to be sensitive to the suffering on the world. On the other hand, you have to come to terms with the fact that you're helpless of a lot of suffering in the world. Like a lot of the big causes of suffering, you can't really do anything about. And trying to navigate that and to retain hope and to do small acts of kindness along the way, so that in hopes that one day they may amount or they may influence to being able to do something about the larger parts of suffering, could be a solution. Does that resonate to the more esoteric side of things for you, Giles?
I want to also say, I've in AA meetings, you encounter a lot of corrupt people, bad people. They're objectively bad. They've done a lot of horrible things. But I think if you take anybody and you put them under the microscope, if we could see deep into their minds what they really think and feel, it's not going to be great. I think service, this type of service being available to help, is one of the only redeeming qualities of humans, right? And I've watched some of the worst people, people who spent their life drunk, destroyed their families, beat their children, whatever, actually save hundreds of lives through service, right? And then you throw out, is this a good or bad person? Who cares? This person is acting and serving and they're helping people. And I've talked about this with Reem about helping people. I've been able to help a few people through years of giving them just attention and care, right? You can't make a big impact in a day. It's a sustained effort, and you see that with AA, people caring over long periods of time. Um, but I'm hoping that the fear and the chaos right now doesn't crush people. We need to act. We need to think about, it's ambiguous what is right and wrong and all these things, but what is your system? What do you believe in, right? And know that, and then stick to it and act on it, and with an idea of serving others or helping others, right? And me and Dylan on many, many episodes talk about just working on yourself is a great service, right? I've taken over the years, I've go, this is definitely a character flaw in me. And maybe it takes 5 years to resolve that, but I've resolved it. And that's been a big benefit to the people around me. And you take them one at a time, and then being of service in hard times instead of closing down and being scared and going into this delusional world of fear and panic, um, can be a type of comfort zone and in taking yourself off the hook. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that is a very nice note as we sort of come to an end. It sort of reminds me of something, sort of a quote by Mr. Rogers when he said, as a child, when he saw terrible things happen on the news, his mother would say, well, try and look for the helpers. And if I had to change that quote and put a turn of phrase, I would say that if you can't look for the helpers, if the helpers are nowhere to be found, then as you rightly say, Joss, you should try and be a helper. Even if the person that you're helping happens to be yourself. And that's all you get around to at the end of the day.
And we can shift our attention from noticing everything that's going wrong. Look at free trade, and when nations are working together, when people are working together, and there's a harmony that exists in the mundane world. Every day I look at, Manhattan, this monster, and I think about the plumbing and the electricity and all the people that get up. No one here can afford housing, yet every month we pay, and every month to me, it's incredible that this place even runs at all. but it does. It's this harmony. It's not perfect,
Uh,
but there is a harmony.
yeah, there
Every
is.
day people wake up and do their job
Yeah.
and sustain each other. There's a bunch of imperfect, crazy New Yorkers, right? But there is a type of societal harmony here.
Yeah. Yeah. I did remember that. It was, I think, an advice from a priest who was saying that if you feel anxiety and depressed, get up in the morning, pray, and then go volunteer, at a public soup or someplace, and then do it again the next day. And very soon you're excited, probably then you realize how much good you can do even in a small place. Because everything you describe about what's going on in Ukraine, I kid you not, you can find it in your backyard. I mean, I'm
Mhm.
here in LA and I can go in, Southeast LA, and I'll find people who are in really, really dire situation. I mean, you can find the best and the worst in any place you work. I think maybe that's the reason why I asked the question about morality and ethics and all this, because it's never going to be clear, right? You can only do whatever you can and the best you can, and then focus on it, because they say you can't foresee the impact of any act you do. Right? There's this woman who she said she had this kind of near-death experience, and supposedly on the other side, she met that light, that being of light, and who were going to show her something, one of the greatest things she's ever done, and one of the worst she's ever done. And she said she did a lot of good things in her life. I didn't buy her own kind of standard. But the thing that was shown to her was paying the bill of the single mom at the store, which for her was nothing. And she said, well, I was a single mom myself, I could relate, so I just paid that. And the worst she ever did was to be very critical of one of her colleagues who were a nurse. And they showed her that that nurse had worked so hard to come out of trauma, to be able to be a nurse and help. So whatever she was doing, potentially imperfect, but miles away from where she comes from. I'm not sure how true the whole thing is, but it gives you an idea how hard it is for humans to, for us, at least with this limited consciousness, to get some idea how much impact or good or bad what we do every day will do. But you can at least keep at it, and then at least focus on whatever you control. And as you said, Josh, help one person, work on yourself. I think this is where this is the best we can definitely do here. But I think I wanted to to ask again another question to Dylan. So we talking like the people who press the button are not directly morally connected, but the people who are in it, because we've been shielded as American, as you said, from full-on war outside of warfare. But if we are ever in such a situation, right, meaning I'm living with my family, somebody is attacking me, I'm defending myself, and I'm gonna do horrible things too, and all that. Is there a Buddhist view of that? Because I think I heard and read about that is the detachment from the act that actually help with the karma, for instance, but rather than the actual emotional involvement of thinking or feeling guilty. If you have any comment on that.
Yeah, so there is no sure way to avoid sort of the psychological impact. So karma, not in the sort of Hindu sense of the word, but rather just in the Buddhist sense of just volitional action, or merely the law of karma, of cause and effect, is just a description of cause and effect. So if something happens, it will have effects. And so it's a kind of you can't really escape an effect if the effect is going to occur. As to what to do in that particular situation, the Buddha is actually quite adaptable and open to the idea of trying your best, as we mentioned before. To relate it back to war, in one of the supposed Buddha's lifetime, he was something called, a wheel-turning monarch, and he achieved peace in his kingdom by essentially raising an army and conquering everybody else. He's not denying that that is one way to go about it. So violence is a way to achieving peace. And so arguably, when it comes to defending your own home, defending, self-defense, violence is a way to do it. But the Buddha pointed out that there are a few observations. One, that is sort of short term. There's only so long that of peace you could achieve through violence, because there's going to be the next person, just like you, who think that they could achieve something by doing violence. So how do you sort of stop the next person. You can't win forever, right? That is the idea. And of course, as you rightly point out, there's the psychological impact of doing violence. So the Buddha decided that actually the solution that he opted for in the end is to go for psychological development and wisdom and education. So personally, right, to himself, there was a psychological development and discipline, working through his own problems and so on and so forth, and then educating and imparting his experiences and wisdom to others. So that may not be as direct and as quick and as satisfying as violence, but that is far more long-term. And that sort of goes towards dealing with the root of the problem. But some people might ask, okay, so what if a burglar comes to my house? What do I do? Am I not allowed to, if I'm a Buddhist, am I not allowed to engage in self-defense? Of course not, right? The Buddha says, well, you are going to do what you're going to do in that particular situation. So whatever it is, you try your best to be moral, but go with what you think is best, and then work out the consequences afterwards. The only fix to a problem like that is to not put yourself in that position in the first place. So once you're already in that position, it's too late. Now you're only dealing with consequences. But ideally, the Buddha says that if you sort of live a certain life, or you're trying to live a certain life in an ethically disciplined life where you don't try and engage in the causes of conflict and of violence, then you are decreasing the likelihood of violence ever finding itself upon you. Right? So as a long-term fix, that is the way to do it. But even then, right, as you rightly said, you can't control if a burglar decides to come to your house, right? But the Buddha said, well, there are things you could have done beforehand that are not entirely felt that can make things easier, like not flaunting your wealth, right? But even then, right? Who says,
Yes.
right? There are certain things that are just simply out of your control. And so at the end of the day, the Buddha wants us to sort of, yes, there's all of these discussions about karma and things like that and moral responsibility. But at the end of the day, the reason why the Buddha says life is suffering is that by its nature, it just isn't fair. You can do your best, right? You can do all the right things, make no mistakes, and bad things will still happen. That's why we need to engage in Buddhist practices and meditate, because it's not fair. There is no sort of ultimate karmic justice system that will fix everything for you. And so, there's another story that I spoke about another day to another student, about there was a farmer who had a lot of problems with his field with thieves, with his wife and his child. And he heard that the Buddha was coming into town. So he thought, well, if anybody who could solve my problems, it would be this so-called enlightened person. So he goes to the Buddha and he asks, I've got this problem and this problem and this problem. And the Buddha says, well, I can't really solve any of those for you. And he was quite disappointed. It's like, how could that be? If you're an enlightened person, how could you not solve my problems? And the Buddha says, well, let's put it this way. If you dedicated your entire life to trying to fix one of those problems, you might succeed. And then so he was very dissatisfied with that answer. It's like, that doesn't seem very wise to say. Although it says, to look at it from a different way, as far as I can see, you only have one problem. And it says, great, I could do that. I could solve that one problem. And it says, well, your problem is that you think life shouldn't have any problems whatsoever. So yes, like life, being alive entails problems, but never, and they may or may not be your fault. But the idea is that nevertheless, you try and do your best and you cope and you find the way out of it that causes the least amount of suffering as possible for yourself and others. That's the general framework. But there is no perfect ideal answer, right? There is no perfect escape from karma. Like we mentioned before the call started about how just in virtue of being alive, you are causing harm to something. Right? Just in virtue of consuming anything, food, clothing, transportation, there must be some harm done. But nevertheless, you try your best to try and do some good as well. Not a very satisfying answer, but an answer.
No, it is satisfying. This is good.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'd like to build on what Just said. It made me funny. He said a bunch of imperfect New Yorkers. Yeah, because I think yesterday I was on a hike and we were talking about, because I'm in the field of water and environmental and all this, and most people have no idea when somebody pick up the garbage where it goes and all the hoops that people have to go through. I mean, because a few years ago, one of the landfills here had to be closed and had to find a new one. I mean, that's a very stressful and took a long time, but most people, still had their garbage picked up here. And you're right, you see it this way. There's a lot of things that goes in the back where people that seemingly can do bad thing one day but do great thing for all of us for our life to go on, for sure. Thank you for that.
I've seen a lot of funny things here, like like a pizza shop, there's someone who needs food. They're begging for food, right? And someone buys them food, and then the guy eating the food starts talking to them, and the person who bought the food is like, just fuck off. I don't want to talk to you. You got your food. Like they're nice, but they're mean. Or like there's a whole system of mothers who depend on people carrying the strollers up the stairs. And no matter where they go, someone carries the strollers up the stairs. And they may be upset while they do it, Or people who run their whole business on a sidewalk and have these stuff. Like there's all these little Latin women who sell like spicy mangoes and stuff. They can't carry that stuff up the stairs, but every day there's someone who carries it up the stairs for them, And they may not be happy about it. They might just be doing that to help the flow of traffic, but I don't know. There's stuff, you see what I mean? There's kind of like a harmony, a very imperfect harmony, but there is a system in that works and functions based on service, whether it's perfect or not. I think most of us are flawed and imperfect, and we do a lot of harm knowingly and unknowingly, but it's a service. I think even just showing up and doing your job well
Yeah.
can be a way of I tell you, like you go to places just trying to get a basic service done, and people just won't do the job. Like the U.S. Post Office. My
I
God,
agree.
just places.
Yeah, but I think, for instance, I remember when, going back to war, I was talking to a Muslim scholar who said that because I think when Islam started, that people were fighting them so hard that if they did not expand, they would have probably disappeared. So for them, basically conquering everybody else was kind of a matter of survival. So either they do it or then it's happened to them. That it's kind of always hard to know where to start. Now, obviously, once they started, they went really far.
hmm
And then obviously maybe the desire to be powerful and to expand. But initially, it was so I think Romans used to say, "He who loves peace prepares for war." So we got to balance things here.
Me and my mom have a funny one. Back in Hurricane Ivan, our neighborhood was flooded, and there was no police that could get to us. And there's groups of people who came looting all the homes, right? And so as a neighborhood, we had to actually find out who our neighbors were, make a plan. We set up a gate on the road, and everyone had guns, including my mom. And we had to defend our property. We had to defend each other. There wasn't the time to think about, pacifism and political realism and stuff. There's just things that needed to get done. And as soon as that problem was over, we went back to not knowing our neighbors, and everyone went back to their homes and watching TV, and there's no idea whatever happened to any of those people. I don't know. It's a challenging time. The
It is.
ethics of war are complicated and vague, and there's not any straightforward answers to right or wrong. And the problem with war and violence is there's not time to think. You kind of fall back onto your reactions and survival instincts. And I think that's one reason why spiritual training, like Dylan was talking about, and Reem and you, Kapu, are important, is maybe have a gap in those reactions where you could
I'll take that.
prevent from going too far, right? Getting carried away if you are acting in violence during these times, to not to go too far, or to not be a coward and not act, right? And we can all do very simple things to benefit our community, making a painting, reaching out to someone, who's affected by war, and there's this guy in the Caribbean who painted these tiki sculptures with the Ukrainian flag on it. And through my friend Derek, he got it and he brought it to his friend in Scandinavia who brought it to someone actually in the Ukraine. And this sculpture had traveled, this really tiny thing for that person in the Caribbean had traveled the whole world to end up there. And the soldier had it, a soldier who was actually going out into combat to fight the Russians.
Wow.
That little act had traveled, and it meant so much to him to think that this person in this little tiny island out in the Caribbean is making these little keychains that somehow managed to travel all the way around to get to him. And that guy who became a soldier was a musician, had never held a gun or anything, a musician in his 20s, was now in full combat.
Wow.
I hope the benefits of this meeting,
Oh,
flow
yeah.
out to our communities, around the globe like that little tiki sculpture.
Yeah.
So thank you guys for showing up on your Sunday. And I'll be putting the recording out today. And I'll see you guys next time.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for putting it.